Hello. Uh, in this video, I'm going to be talking about the history of our units of length, the old-fashioned ones, feet and miles, and some others like perch and fathom and what have you. This is a bit different from my usual videos, which are much more mathematical. But of course, I will be drawing out the aspects of this history that, as a mathematician, I find particularly interesting. So let's go. That's my title. Um, the story of the foot, yard, and mile, and some others, and some others, and some others, and in fact some others as well. They've all got different origins, and it's quite interesting. They are, of course, the origins of both the British Imperial system, which was used throughout the British Empire, of course, that's why it's called that, and it's still used to a limited extent in various parts of the Commonwealth, and also the American customary units. And we'll see how that developed as well. But I've called it English units of length for a reason here. Because my history is going back way beyond the point where they were British units of system. They were just English. The Scottish had other units of length, which I think were similar but different. I'm not talking about them. But we go back to start with, even before there was an England. Let's think about measuring length in ancient times. If we go all the way back to hunter-gatherers, would they have measured length? Well, possibly, if only because there were probably fishermen amongst them, and they would have wanted to say the one that got away was yay long. Um, but they probably didn't have units of length. When people started settling down and farming and making buildings, they might have done. They would have been said to one another things like, go and get me a bunch of sticks twice as tall as yourself, or whatever. But they probably didn't have anything what we'd call units. I think it's the coming of cities that bring about units of length. Because once you get a big building project with craftsmen coming from far and wide, it would be a really good thing if they were all using the same units of length, wouldn't it? And I think that's probably the driver. I don't really know the details of that because nobody does because it's from before history. But we do know uh, some things about the very ancient history. So, when was the first international unit of length, do you suppose? Well, it's down to Sargon of Akkad, who lived in Mesopotamia 4 and a bit thousand years ago, and he issued a standard cubit for use across his realms. I'm using international in a rather liberal sense here. So Sargon was an emperor, not just a king, so he ruled over several countries, and he got his cubit used across all those different countries. Um, Cubit is a measure that was widely used in ancient times in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and basically the sort of Near East part of the world. And it's mentioned in the Bible, of course. Um, and it's this measure. It's the measure from there to there, from elbow to fingertip. So it's a body part like the foot, just a different body part. We don't have Sargon's actual standard cubit, but here's an earlier standard. It's not a very good picture. You have to peer quite closely at this dark piece of copper across here. It's actually a double cubit, so that's dividing it into two cubits. That gives you a scale, and it's further divided in various ways. Um, and that's from 2,500 years BC. And here's a more modern one. It's only 1,500 years BC, and what a beautiful object that is. Folding cubit rule from the ancient Egyptian cubits. Now, the Egyptians had actually two cubits because I don't know whether you've seen pictures from ancient Egypt. Um, in the pictures, the pharaoh, the king, always appears much bigger than anybody else because he was more important. And there's a curious sort of reflection of that in their measurements. So they had a cubit, and then they had the royal cubit, which I suppose was meant to be the king's forearm, and it was a lot bigger. So they used two different qubits, an ordinary qubit and the royal qubit. Right. Now, you might think that all this qubit stuff has nothing to do with English units of measure. You'd be wrong there because we have a thing called or it used to have a thing called the L, which was actually a double qubit, like that Egyptian standard. And the word L comes from the same root as the word elbow. So it's double qubit. It's sort of that distance from one elbow to the other. It gets mentioned in the Magna Carta, and also, this is a nice thing from the Stourbridge Fair, which is just outside Cambridge in 1514. There's a notice saying, all persons that selleth by measure, as by ell or by yard, woolen cloth or linen cloth, silk, worsteds, dot, 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 that they have their ells and their yards sized and ensealed after the standard of the university, under the pain of forfeiture and their bodies to prison. So give short measure and you end up in clink. So they used yards and ells then, and they're much the same size. An ell was variously defined over history as sometimes as a yard and a handful, which is 40 inches or so, a yard and an inch at this point, and that's probably the value that it had in 1514, and then later a yard and a quarter, which is 45 inches. So it's much the same length as a yard, and at this point in history, it's being defined in terms of the yard. And you really don't need both. You can't really need two units of measure that are so similar, uh, but they've got different origins somehow, and so they lasted for a long time. The L survived for a long time as as a measure of cloth. Basically, it's used in the cloth business across Europe. There were L's, and not all the same size, of course, across Europe throughout much of the sort of medieval, early modern period, including the English one and a Scottish one actually, which was slightly different. Okay. It did eventually die out, though. We don't have ells anymore. The cubit was Mesopotamian, basically, and Egyptian. In Europe, in ancient Europe, it was more about the foot. So the Greeks and the Romans had feet. The Greek foot was pretty much the same size as ours, and that was divided into 16 digits. And the Roman foot was a little shorter, but much the same, really, and divided either into 16 digits or 12 unciae, which means a 12th, but it's from our word, where our word inch comes from, of course. So it turns out, in fact, that so an inch is basically a thumb, and a digit is basically a finger, which is a bit smaller. So an inch is that distance there, roughly across your thumb. And in fact, for my particular thumb, that distance there is almost exactly an inch, and that distance across there is almost exactly 3 inches, which is 16 to the foot. So for me, the inch is a real body part measure. So they used their foot across the empire, and when they'd retreated, they left their foot behind, including in Britain, where it was used in what we nowadays call the construction business, the building trades or whatever, for hundreds and hundreds of years. So there are some other feet that people around the world have sort of in ancient times have reconstructed. There's a rather mysterious thing called the Neolithic long foot, I'm not sure whether that really was a thing. It's constructed in two sorts of ways. There are some monuments, quite a lot of measures of which are roughly integral multiples of roughly this long, which is not very convincing. There are also some measuring drum things that are taken to be measuring drums. You wrap a string round and they're that long or some multiple of that long. And well, is that a real thing? I don't know. Much more real is this one. So the Belgian or Northern foot it's called, which is a bit longer than our foot. Belgic Northern is a Northern European measure. It arrived in England with the Anglo-Saxons, who got here in the sort of 6th century or so. So sometime around then, we acquired this Belgian foot, and we'd already got the Roman foot. So we had two of them for quite some while, as we shall see. We'll get on to that story. So another very important unit in historical times is the perch, or rod or pole, it's sometimes called. Um, Another very ancient use, and this one's origin is surveying. This arrived with the Anglo-Saxons as well, um, and it's a long stick, basically, they use for measuring land. So the Anglo-Saxons were sort of agricultural folk. They weren't really city builders, so they didn't really have at least to begin with, a measure for a foot length measure. That sort of arrived later, I think. Their basic measure was the perch, which was measuring land. It comes from the same word as pike, basically, which is a weapon. And here are some pikes from 2,500 years BC. Long spears, basically. And the Romans had a pike, pertica, which meant both the weapon, the pike, and also the measure, which was about 10 feet, 10 Roman feet. And the Anglo-Saxons had the perch, and it was their basic measure. And the Belgic foot was a 15th of a perch. So that's where that 13.7 inches come from. It's not that anymore. It's now 16 and a half feet or 5.5 yards and has been for a long time. So why that curious quantity? Well, so as we've seen, before about 1300, England had 2 feet, the Roman foot and the Belgic foot. One used by builders, basically, and others used basically by surveyors. So the Roman foot was used in the building trades. The slightly longer that was a surveying unit. And the king decided the thing to do was to join up the perch, which was a fundamental unit, with the Roman foot. Um, and so they wanted his object was to get rid of the Belgic foot and keep the Roman foot and the perch the same. So that meant, so the obvious thing would have been surely to have reduced the length of the perch so that it was so that it was still 15 of these Roman feet. But Parliament wouldn't hold for that because Parliament were rich landowners, and the perch was the measure by which land was measured, was the unit by which land was measured, and therefore by which tax was assessed. And if the perch got shorter, they were afraid that their land would look bigger and their taxes would go up. So they weren't having that. So we had to have the perch kept the same, and we would have to keep the builder's foot the same. And so we ended up with this ugly kludge that now you have to have 16 and a half feet to the perch, and that's or 5.5 yards, and that's where this strange factor of 11 comes from. So this 1760, I don't know whether worried about ever wondered about why there's a factor of 11 there. Well, that's where it comes from. It comes from this thing. The composition of yards and perches. This was a statute sometime around 1300, and it says this. It is ordained that 3 grains of barley, dry and round, do make an inch. 12 inches make 1 foot. 3 feet make 1 yard. 5 yards and a half make a perch. And 40 perches in length and 4 in breadth make an acre. So there's a reminder that the perch is all about measuring land. So 40 perches by 4 is an acre. This makes it look as though the barley grain was sort of the base unit from which all the others were derived. I sort of don't believe that, really. It can't be true, can it? I can't imagine all the carpenters in the world reading this or being told this, and, oh, I've got to go out into the field and gather 36 grains of barley in order to find how long my foot should be. I don't believe it for a minute. And the whole point of this thing was to keep the foot the same and the perch the same. So I don't know what this barleycorn business is really all about. But there's an interesting little thing here about standards. So if you want to have a standard length, you've either got to make an actual physical standard and then send copies of it all around your realm, your country, or your empire, or whatever. Or else you've got to give people the information to construct one for themselves. And so I suppose this is a sort of attempt to do the latter. You say, well, if you can't get to your local city where there's a standard yard, or standard foot or whatever, then here's what'll do. It's 3 barleycorns. I don't know about that. So this 40 perches in length, by the way, is a furlong, and seems always to have been. I think that's an ancient unit as well. Furlong, by the way, means the length of a furrow, so it's roughly the length that a team of oxen can plough before they get tired and need a rest. Then you have to turn them round and plough the other way. And it seems always to have been 40 perches. This barleycorn business, by the way, it is sort of a proper unit, and it's preserved in the UK shoe sizes, which are measured in barleycorns. It's the length of your foot in barleycorns minus 23. So the important part of that, I suppose, is that successive shoe sizes are 1/3 of an inch apart. Right, now what about yards? So this is very strange, actually. Strange little story. So originally, the word yard was a measure of area, and it was a quarter of a hide. And a hide in Anglo-Saxon times was the amount of land you needed to feed a family. So I suppose it depended on the quality of the land. Good farming land, a hide was probably smaller than the mountains in mountainous areas. Anyway, so a yard was a quarter of one of those. So it's a land measuring exercise and a tax gathering measure as well. Somehow the word seems to have came to be applied to a stick used for measuring area, or maybe there were two words that got confused. There were in fact two Old English words, which are very similar. One of which meant basically a garden, which I suppose is the area thing, and one of which meant basically a stick. So somehow there's a confusion there, perhaps. I don't know. Anyway, we end up with yards as a unit of measure, and it's this sort of length. And by 963, which is a long time ago, there was a standard yard held at Winchester, which at the time was the capital of England. insofar as England was a real country at that point. Part of it was anyway. So around 1120, when England really was a proper country, England Henry I introduced a standard yard to correct the false L of the traders. So why he didn't produce a standard L if that was his object, I don't know, but he didn't. He produced a standard yard. Um, so there's a history of standard yards after that. It became the base unit, fundamentally, from which everything else was derived. In 1588, there was a new one, a brass standard, and a brass standard L, and a brass standard L. That's interesting, isn't it? Um, and in 1824, another new standard was the distance between two gold studs on a brass rod, believe it or not. That was held in Parliament, but unfortunately Parliament burnt down. So a few years later they had to make another one, and they put it in the Tower of London, which they thought would be safer. This time of bronze. And they had copies sent all around the country, and copy number 11 went to the USA. And then much later on, the yard was defined in terms of meters. So that's the so now a yard is exactly 0.9144 meters. Okay, so I mentioned that business about Americans getting a copy of our standard yard. The Americans for a long time had bigger feet than we did because in 18 so up to 1893, from that 1845 date, we used the same foot. And then in 1893, the foot was metricated. It was turned into, it was adjusted so that 1 meter was exactly 39.37 inches. So that was the American foot. Um, and our foot didn't change at that point. It was slightly shorter than that. Um, but then from 1959, we've all used this international foot that I've mentioned, which is 0.9144, or 1 inch is exactly 25.4 millimeters. Um, so that settled the yard and the perch and the chain and the furlong and the mile and goodness knows what else, barleycorn, I suppose. All those then became definite metric measures. However, the Americans continued with 2 feet for a while. So this older one, their older metricated standard, was overtaken by the international foot in 1959, except but all the official maps were made using this because all the surveys had been done that way, and so this older foot became known as the survey foot. And so for a while in America there were 2 feet, and this one didn't eventually get pensioned off until 2022, very recently. Okay, let's look at some other units. So the chain. This is a question of decimalizing the furlong. I've mentioned the furlong was 40 perches and had been for a very long time. So this is the surveyor's chain, or also known as Gunter's chain, because it was invented by Edmund Gunter in 1620. And a chain is a tenth of a furlong, and it's divided into 100 links. So that's really rather good. And it took the world over really as a surveying instrument. It's clearly much more practical to use a chain to measure large lengths, the size of fields and what have you, than it is to use a long wobbly stick, which is what a perch is. It's very cumbersome. The chain's actually longer too, so it all makes it a whole lot easier. Um, so and it's still in use across large parts of the world in sort of semi-hidden ways. In the UK, it's still in use on the railways. If you look on railway bridges, for example, the little plaque tells you how far it is from the terminus in miles, furlongs, and chains. And in railway slang, chainage basically means distance. Okay, let's move on to bigger units. So the land mile. This is really odd. Um, so much of this story is quite strange, really. So the land mile, the Romans had a mile, which was 1,000 paces, double paces. So it's sort of left foot to left foot, if you like, as you're marching along, left, right, two, right, three, and it's 1,000 of those, which is 5,000 Roman feet. Mile comes from the Latin mille, meaning 1,000, of course. But many other miles have existed. And in England, only in 1593, that's long after that 1300 date, was the land mile defined by statute to be 8 furlongs. Here is this thing. a mile shall contain 8 furlongs. Every furlong, 40 poles. Poles are perch, and same thing. And it always has been that. So there's nothing new there, and it's not changing that thing either. So just defining the mile basically. Um, but even then, other miles were available. It was by no means standard that was readily accepted. So here, for example, is a map from 1724 that hangs in my hall. It it happens to be a map of Northamptonshire. That doesn't matter. But look in the bottom left-hand corner. So this is a scale of 10 miles, but there's a choice of miles here. You can have great, middle, or small miles. No idea what that's about. I just don't understand that. But it illustrates the point that miles didn't settle down and become standard definite units until much, much later than all these other things. And there's another unit that's sort of roughly the same size, which is the League. And it's never really settled down properly, actually. So again, the Romans had one. It's 1.5 miles, it was called, and it was the Loega Gallica. So again, this is silly, isn't it? You've got two measures that are very much the same length, a mile and a league. Why do you need both? Well, you don't, of course. Um, and so the hint's in the name, Loega Gallica. It's the Gallic League. So when they conquered Gaul, they discovered that these pesky Gauls had already got a unit of length, which they called the league. And so the Romans sort of had to adopt that, at least locally. I don't suppose they used it much anywhere else, but so it was called the Gallic League. Mostly the league has been basically an hour's walk. So that depends on how hard the terrain is, isn't it? It probably depends on the time of year, doesn't it, actually? If it's raining, you don't walk so fast. Anyway, so sometimes it's defined to be 3 miles, but it's never really become a proper unit that everybody uses. And I don't think it is now defined in metric terms like everything else. Now, on the subject of miles, nautical miles are interesting. Um, so miles at sea, these are not a terribly ancient unit because in ancient times, people didn't really do anything that we'd recognize as navigating. They did sail quite long distances, but they sailed hugging the coast. They aspired never to lose sight of the coast, and they didn't really have a measure of distance at sea. So, however, the notion of the nautical mile, in a sense, goes back to those times. It was Ptolemy of Alexandria who estimated that 1 degree of a great circle arc round the Earth. So he knew the Earth was round and he knew what size it was. And 1 degree, say 1 degree around the equator, for example, would be 62 Roman miles. So a bit more than 60 miles. So that would mean that 1 minute of arc would be just over just over a Roman mile. And that's what's been used since. That is sort of what the definition of a nautical mile is. So in the 15th century, when people did start navigating seriously and people started making proper maps, charts for use at sea began to be produced using a nautical mile, which was equal to 1 arc minute. So that's longer than a land mile. And that was eventually metricated. Um, and while we're at sea, let's talk about the fathom. This is a very ancient. This is genuinely is an ancient. Unlike the nautical mile, this one really is ancient because although those people in ancient times didn't really measure distance at sea, they did need to measure depth so that they could know whether they could sail their ships into this harbour or not. Um, so it's a measure of depth. It's nowadays called 6 feet. Um, and it's actually this distance, your outstretched arms, because what you do to measure depth is you have a weight on the end of a rope and you play the rope out, 1, 2, 3, and that's how many fathoms of depth there is. So it's the length of outstretched arms. And the ancient Greeks had this very unit. It was called the orgia or something like that. I don't know how you pronounce that. And it probably goes back to the Phoenicians some while earlier, 800 BC. They sailed around the Mediterranean and beyond. They were great sailors. And we know they took soundings. We knew that they did measure depth like this, so they probably used fathoms. But I can't be absolutely sure about that. So to sort of summarize some of this, it seems to me there are three domains of measuring. There's sort of the construction industry and domestic, which are these sorts of units. Oh, I didn't mention the hand, did I? That's the hand is this width. this width here, and it's for measuring horses, measuring the height of horses. Uh, so the Egyptian royal cubit was divided into 7 palms, which is a hand. So it is a very ancient unit. I don't imagine there's any direct connection between that ancient Egyptian hand and the British English measure for measuring the height of horses, but who knows? Um, anyway, these are the sort of domestic units. These are the surveying units. I've included fathom in there because that's sort of surveying, isn't it? And then there are journeys, which are these longer units. And it's interesting, isn't it, that these are the ones that took the longest to settle down. And in fact, really, this one is the earliest. Sorry, this one is the earliest in a way. I don't know about league, actually, I suppose that did too, but that's very undefined. So we can see the 1300 Act as joining these lot together, and the 1593 one, which defined the mile, as joining these ones together. So this one was quite a lot later. The yard's interesting. Its origin is in this group, but it really belongs in this group nowadays. And it must have done, and it did here too, because it's ended up this side of that strange factor of 5.5. So we now have the perch as a strange number of yards. We don't have the yard as a strange number of feet. So the yard had definitely established itself as one of these by 1300. Um, so there we are. So in my next video, I'm going to talk about the meter. But just before doing that, let's have a quick look at at least the early history of the American customary unit. So in 1830, before that, I suppose the states, well, and before that, the colonies all had their own units of length, I suppose. But in 1830, Congress decided to create uniform standards across all the states. And their experts said, oh, use the metric system, which by then was well established in Europe. But the Congress wasn't having that. They adopted the British standard, which is a bit odd, actually. So in this sort of time, I would have thought American Congress would have been quite pro-France and anti-Britain. But anyway, they adopted the British standard unit rather than the French metric system. So there we are. I hope you enjoyed that.